subject matter you and I have discussed before individually and with the Congressional Black Caucus and others, and Senator Durbin, I know, brought it up. I watched that back and forth. And you said in that conversation you don't investigate ideology, but clearly for jihadists to white supremacists, the ideology as a motivating factor helps you in your investigations, correct?
Certainly ideology can be a very important part of an investigation if there is all the other pieces that we have to be able to investigate.
Yeah. And so this is what's worrying me right now is the significance of white supremacist attacks. We've had, since 9/11, a lot of terrorist attacks, but the majority of them have been right-wing. The attacks here in the United States have, if I'm correct, the majority of them have been right-wing extremist attacks. The majority of those have been white supremacists. Is that correct?
Well, I want to get a little bit careful when what I'm counting and what's the numerator and the denominator of what, but I will say that certainly domestic terrorism, violent extremism of all shapes and sizes, when it turns to violence, is something that is of great concern, that is a continuing, steady, persistent, serious threat that we're taking very seriously. And I will say that at least over some recent memory, an awful lot of the racially motivated violent extremism is motivated by what you might call kind of a white supremacist type of ideology.
And I guess that's what I want to drill down on. We know from a 2017 declassified joint intelligence briefing from 2000 to 2016 that white supremacist extremists were responsible for more homicides than any other domestic extremist groups. That's according to a report that was declassified. And based on your testimony, the number of arrests this year of internationally inspired homegrown extremists is roughly the same as the number of arrests for domestic violent extremists, the majority of whom, again, are white supremacist groups. And to me, that's a stunning data point, a stunning amount of violence that's occurring in our country motivated by white supremacy, and why it's all the more important that we understand the full scope of that threat. And I know you take this very seriously. And so for more than a decade, the FBI used 11 different categories to describe and document domestic terrorist threats. And these categories included a separate category for white activity, white supremacist activity or incidents. That's correct, right?
Yes.
Okay. But now the administration is using a system with only 4 categories. And one of those categories is called racially motivated violent extremism. That's correct, right?
We do have 4 categories, and one of them is called racially motivated violent extremism.
Right, and this new category combines incidents involving white supremacists with a new category that we've discussed before called black identity extremists. And so that's really problematic to me. And when did the FBI eliminate the white supremacist category in favor? That was just in the last number of years, right? In favor of that racially motivated violent extremism category.
Well, let me say this, that we have tried to make clear, and some of it, frankly, is based on conversations that you and I had about not the white supremacist part, but about the other part. Remember, we had some very constructive, hard-hitting conversations early on about that. And I think one of the points that we've tried to emphasize to our folks across all of these vectors is that we only investigate violence. We don't investigate extremism. We don't investigate ideology. We don't investigate rhetoric. It doesn't matter how repugnant, how abhorrent, or whatever it is. There's got to be those 3 things that we talked about before for there to be an investigation. And so what we have tried to do by our recategorization is make clear that it's about the violence, not about the ideology. And that's the nature of the categorization.
And if I can make this point then, this new category of black identity extremism has caused extreme concern. It's caused concern amongst the law enforcement community, and you know that members of the law enforcement community in November of 2017, the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives issued a pretty strong statement that black identity extremism really is hurting the community and the ability for law enforcement. You've seen the reaction from both congressional leaders and the more. The report, quote unquote, resurrected the historically negative legacy of African American civil rights leaders who were unconstitutionally targeted and attacked by federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies. the investigative merits of the report do not warrant the belief that an ideology movement is even there, that exists among African Americans that predisposes them to negatively target law enforcement officers. And so quite specifically, how many violent attacks, if you're investigating violence, how many violent attacks and facilities have been attributed to white supremacists since 2017? And how many violent attacks and fatalities have been attributed to so-called black identity extremists since August 2017?
I don't have numbers of that sort here sitting in this
Has there
hearing
been
room.
any, to your knowledge,
Any what?
attacks attributed to so-called black identity extremists? Has there been any since 2017 whatsoever? This so-called new movement.
I think we have had attacks within the racially motivated violent extremist category that cover both ends of the spectrum, if you will.
I mean, but that language, you just said both ends of the spectrum. The murders at synagogues, murders that we've seen motivated since 2017 that you've grievously had to deal with, you said both ends of the spectrum, as if there is actually a movement of, black identity extremism. It's almost creating this reality that there's a spectrum that goes back and forth. I'm really questioning that language you
Right.
used.
We don't use the term black identity extremism anymore, first. Second, you mentioned NOBLE, the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. I have met on countless occasions with them. I value that partnership. I've significantly energized it. And we have discussed with them as well some of the efforts we're making to try to better characterize and categorize the work we're doing.
And forgive me, this is news to me. So you no longer use the black identity extremism. That's no more. That category. That's great. That's great news. So nobody's being surveilled or investigated on the black identity extremism.
We don't use that terminology anymore. That was part of the reorganization of all of our domestic terrorism threat categorization. That terminology went away as part of this racially motivated violent extremism category. So whatever properly predicated investigations there are or were that would be previously have under that label would now be within this racially motivated violent extremism category.
Okay. I look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sir. Thank you, sir.
Okay, Senator Lee will take us to one.